Okay, thank you. And tonight I'll be talking about my newly released book, The Years of Great Silence, which is on the history of ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union. Although the first chapter of the narrative, after I deal with source bases, is on the Russian Empire when they originally came into the territory. And so a couple things here. First, process of writing. I don't have that much to say about it, other than my namesake or surname, Frederick Pohl. To paraphrase him, writing is about sitting down and typing. So it's just a matter, really, of having the willpower to sit down and write and then edit. Although this particular project there were big chunks of it that had been written as long ago as 2011 when I was in Ghana. The title refers to what the ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union themselves referred to. Jahre des großen Schweigens, the years of great silence in the German, that they were not allowed to write or talk about their experience in the 1940s and early 1950s up until the late 80s and early 90s as the Soviet Union fell apart under Gorbachev, and we had a massive emigration of ethnic Germans out of the former Soviet Union, particularly in 93 and 94, into Germany. So that said, I will concentrate mostly on the material in the book, which does focus primarily on the years 1941 to 1955. And so the first thing perhaps is who are the Russian Germans, as ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union were called. And they are the descendants of colonists that came into the Russian Empire in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, primarily invitations from the Tsar. There were several invitations, but the most important one being the 22nd of July, 1763, by Catherine II. They spoke various dialects of German and were Western rather than Orthodox Christians. So most of them were Lutheran, followed by Catholics. Then there are some Mennonites, and then Reform and other Protestant denominations. But they are not Russian Orthodox. And the first manifesto, December 1762, issued by Catherine II, explicitly limited the invitation of foreigners into the Russian Empire to Christians. So it excluded Jews and obviously Muslims. All right, so these colonists start coming in 1764. The term Russian German does not include the Baltic Germans, who were descendant of various Germans that came over during the rule of Estland, Livland, and Courland, today Estonia and Latvia, by the Livonian Knights and then Teutonic Knights. So that is a separate group of people. It really doesn't include the Germans that settled in Poland, even Congress Poland, which becomes part of the Russian Empire in 1815. But it generally does include the Volhynian Germans who almost all came from Congress Poland into Volhynia, as well as a number from northern Germany and Silesia. But the bulk of the settlers in Volhynia, particularly after 1863, are Germans from Congress Poland. All right, so it's refers to a group of people that are very diverse in geography and religion, but can be, by virtue of language and geographic origin in Central Europe, defined as German, even though Germany does not exist as a unified state until 1871. We can also note that in terms of religious belief, most being Lutheran, the next largest group being Catholic, and then some Mennonites. These are all the Western branches of Christianity, distinct from the Russian Orthodox Church that dominated in the Russian Empire. So, the 22nd of July, 1763, Catherine II issues a manifesto inviting in foreigners to come settle in the Volga region, where they come to. About 10 years of initial settlement, 23,000 or so in the Volga region. And after that, we have settlements elsewhere, particularly in the Black Sea region. After 1783, Catherine II annexes Crimean Peninsula and southern Ukraine from the Crimean Khanate. And the area opened up to settlement in 1786. Her son, Paul I, grants a charter of privileges to the Mennonites who start coming from West Prussia to settle in Ukraine. And then her grandson, Alexander I, issues another invitation, specifically targeting people to settle in the Black Sea region. And so over the next 50 years or so, about 70,000 Germans come to settle in Ukraine and Crimea and parts of southern Russia. And we will later have settlements in other parts of the Russian Empire, 1817, 1818, Georgia and Azerbaijan. Colonies are set up, and then daughter colonies from the original settlements in the Volga and Black Sea, moving eastward into Central Asia and the Talas Valley and what is now Kyrgyzstan in 1882, and later into Siberia. So we have, as I said, a great geographical dispersion already in the early 20th century. Well, there were about 2 million ethnic Germans in the Russian Empire, in the one and only all Russian Empire census in 1897. Their height may have been higher prior to that, because in 1871, self-government is revoked from the Russian German. 1874 freedom of conscription is revoked, and we start to see after 1874, significant emigration to the Western Hemisphere, the United States, Canada, Argentina, and Brazil. And this will continue up until the consolidation of communist power in the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution makes getting out of the USSR almost impossible. And so the last immigrants legally coming in 1929 to Canada and Paraguay. And after that, there's some illegal emigration. Uh, but the ethnic Germans in the Russian Empire, for the most part, the migrations are out of the territory occur either before the First World War or after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is actually the largest movement of the ethnic Germans, Russian Germans. So during World War One, the ethnic Germans in the Russian Empire come under a great deal of repression by the Tsarist government. There is the liquidation laws of 1915 requiring them to sell any property or terminate any leases within 150 kilometers of the front. And then they are later, particularly the Bohemian Germans, but also a number from Congress Poland, Bessarabia, even some, are relocated forcibly by the Russian army to the Volga and Siberia. There is plans to forcibly relocate all of the ethnic Germans out of European Russia into Siberia in 1917, but the February Revolution ends these plans. Then there are attempts by various German leaders in the former Russian Empire from the Volga and the Black Sea, Siberia to push for autonomy. The only area that gets significant autonomy as far as the actual territory is on the Volga. And this is not from German activists from below, but from Lenin at the top. It's the first autonomous territory established by the Bolsheviks, and there were later established many. Basically, idea of indirect rule and an affirmative action empire to rule over non-Russians. So in October of 1918, Lenin created the Volga German Workers' Commune as the very first autonomous territory. And it will be upgraded to the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in 1924. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, there's a lot of violence and chaos, a lot of forced requisitioning of food from the German communities by the Bolsheviks that spark uprisings against them that are crushed militarily. There ends up being a famine in both Ukraine, where the Black Sea Germans live, and in the Volga region in 1921 and 1922. So we have a significant number of ethnic Germans perishing, primarily from the 21-22 famine, but also from the violence in the Civil War, massacres by the Bolsheviks, massacres by the anarchist under Nestor Makhno, who attacks the Mennonite communities in Ukraine during the Civil War. So we may have as many as 200,000 premature excess deaths during the period of time 1918 to 1922 among the ethnic Germans that were in the Russian Empire, the territory that becomes the Soviet Union in December 1922 with the Union Treaty and the first Soviet Constitution. Then there is kind of a Silver Age. If the Tsarist period before 1871 was the privileges granted by Catherine II is considered golden age, and we can think of the period of time of the Volga German ASSR and a number of German autonomous districts, smaller units called rayoni in Russian, in Ukraine primarily, but there's one in Crimea, there's one in Georgia, one in Azerbaijan. Altogether, there's 11 of them at height, and they have German language schools, German language newspapers, German language theater, German language book publishing. Most of this concentrated in the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Social Republic, particularly the capital of Engels, obviously named after Friedrich Engels, a German communist collaborator with Karl Marx. And the attempt is to create a socialist German culture within the USSR, centered around the Volga region, but certainly using the German language and adhering to a socialist content ideologically. This fails ultimately for a number of reasons, which I won't get into too much. But the Volga German ASSR, before that the Volga German Autonomous Commune, do create this German language Soviet territory with a German language culture in the middle of the Soviet Union, and it lasts from 1918 to 1941. At the same time, particularly after 1929, we start to see the ratcheting up of repression against Germans. We see during dekulakization, there was a decree in Ukraine to evict German kulaks from Nikolaev Okrug. We see there's a disproportionate number of ethnic Germans that are rounded up and deported as kulaks into special settlement villages in the Soviet far north. And the Urals in 1930 and 1931, particularly from the Volga region. So, whereas they make up only 0.8% of the population of the Soviet Union, and perhaps 1% of the population is dekulakized at this time. Maybe a little bit more, maybe 1.5%. In the Volga German ASSR, something like 6% of the German population, so much higher, disproportionately. But in Ukraine, in particular, the OGPU, the political police, they use a lot of ethnic and racial slurs aimed at Germans during the Kulakization. So there's obviously a conflation of the idea of Kulak, which literally means fist, and ethnic Germans at this time. And 37 and 38 during the Great Terror, during which you have some 680,000 Germans, no, not 680,000 Germans, 680,000 people shot. About 46,000 or so were ethnic Germans, mostly shot, about 29,000 of them during the German operation, particularly in Ukraine. 18,005 out of the 55,000 executions of the German operation are from Ukraine. Very few actually from the Volga German ASSR. So, but the Germans outside of the Volga German ASSR, which are 2/3 of the German population of the Soviet Union, hit hard in Ukraine, hit hard in Siberia during this 37-38 German operation. So, the second largest national operation after the Polish operation. So we have about 5% of the German population executed during this time by the Soviet NKVD, People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. Here we have repression that is wide scale, although not aimed at the entirety of the population yet, is specifically targeting German diaspora in the Soviet Union as being spies and saboteurs due to their cultural connections with Germany, even though in almost all cases they are just their ancestors had left before the unification of Germany in 1871. But the real imposition of repressive policies, the destruction of the German communities in the Soviet Union as viable entities, only comes about in 1941 after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. And it's from 1941 really to 1955 with the era of special settlement, that is the restrictions first imposed upon kulaks and then later other deportees of internal exile, prohibiting them from leaving their assigned settlement, which they are forcibly relocated to, and that we have the years of great silence. So they are imposed by the Soviet government from above on the basis of ancestry, ethno-racially targeted form of repression in the mass forced relocations, and later mobilization of the labor army. The repression, as noted, ramps up from 1929 to 1941 and then reaches its peak in 1941 to 1955. And then there is a partial, slow, and incomplete rehabilitation from 1955 all the way up. The last rehabilitation decree would have been 1989, but prior to Glasnost and Perestroika, the last one is in November of 1972. So when the Germans invade the Soviet Union in 1941, June, there was initially no action taken against the German population of Soviet citizens descended of German immigrants. So in June and July, there are still ethnic Germans fighting in the Soviet Red Army, particularly from the Volga, and particularly they are heroic at the defense of Brest against the Wehrmacht. On 26th of August 1941, the SNK, the Council of People's Commissariats, and the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union order all of the ethnic Germans in the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Social Republic and the neighboring oblast of Saratov and Stalingrad to be forcibly relocated into Kazakhstan and Siberia, mostly Western Siberia, Altai Krai, Novosibirsk Oblast, and Omsk Oblast, but also Krasnoyarsk Krai in Eastern Siberia. 2 days later, on the 28th of August, there was a public decree by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet also ordering the deportation of the Volga Germans from the three territories into Siberia and Kazakhstan. So then they are rounded up by the NKVD with help from Red Army soldiers and normal police and militia, going from village to village and registering their property and putting them on cattle cars and moving these cattle cars eastward to northern Kazakhstan and Siberia. The deportation itself from the Volga region takes place from the 3rd to the 20th of September 1941 and involves almost 500,000 deportees, most of them going into Siberia, the largest group to Novosibirsk, but also we noted that the territory of Krasnoyarsk, which receives about 75,000 Germans, also received most of the urban Germans, particularly from the capital of the Volga German ASSR, Engels, whether the other territories, particularly Kazakhstan, which receives about 100,000 Germans. Most of those are farmers, rural Germans from the Volga, but in any case, the urban minority suffer greater hardship than the rural majority because they are dumped in rural areas to work on collective farms, kolkhozes, which they have no experience. They don't have any property from farms in the Volga region like the kolkhoz workers do that can be compensated for by the exchange of vouchers. Instead, they basically are dumped out in these areas which they have no skills or experience or resources to help them. And this will happen to some other populations as well, particularly Germans from Crimea, who are first evacuated to mostly Ordzhonikidze Krai across the Kerch Straits and 15th of August, before the deportation of the Volga Germans, but they will not be deported as special settlers until October, along with the German population that is already in Ordzhonikidze Krai. So they are dumped out there in the middle of Kazakhstan and Siberia and placed under special settlement restrictions. They can't leave their assigned place of residency without special permission from the NKVD. Extreme lack of housing, food, warm clothing, and medicine. So we have very high morbidity and mortality rates already starting on the trains themselves, which are overpacked, about 40 people per wagon. Usually just a hole in the bottom of it for a toilet. And of course takes a couple of weeks to get from the Volga into the areas of deportation, particularly Krasnoyarsk in eastern Siberia, the furthest away destination. And then shortly thereafter, the Soviet government systematically orders and carries out the deportation of ethnic Germans in other parts of the European USSR, the North Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Moscow, eastern Ukraine, western and central Ukraine have already come under occupation of the Wehrmacht. So only about 100,000 or so Germans in Ukraine are deported in 1941. The other 300,000 or so come under the German military for most of the war. But nonetheless, about 800,000 Germans total, so at least another 300,000 outside of the Volga region, deported from Ukraine, Northern Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and other places in the European USSR to east of the Urals, and then dumped out there without much in the way of resources to keep them alive. This creates a lot of resentment, makes it difficult for them to be integrated into the local economies. And so we see in 1942 there will be a mass mobilization of Germans and the second relocation, particularly for forced labor. So in 10th of January 1942, there are two mobilizations. The first one, about 50,000 Germans from southern Siberia are moved to the northern regions of the Soviet Union, north of the Arctic Circle, along rivers, to work in the fishing industry to extract fish to provide protein for the Soviet Red Army, which is suffering from shortages due to the rapid advance of the German military to take Ukraine, Belarus, and large parts of Western Russia, and depriving the Red Army of the livestock that was being raised there. So this is one of their strategies is to use forced labor, primarily from German special settlers, to extract fish from the rivers and other bodies of water in the Arctic region of the Soviet Union. The second mobilization also starts on 10th of January 1942, GKO Order 1123, And this is the expansion of 4th Labor Detachment that had already begun, both from demobilizations from the Red Army, starting in July, but really getting big after 8th September 1941, when all ethnic Germans are removed from Soviet military units, as well as in eastern Ukraine, some 18,600 adult men from age 16 to 60 were mobilized for forced labor in 1941. So at the beginning of 1942, forced labor detachment, the Germans, about 20,000 people in them. This is kind of the core of what will become called the Labor Army, Tud Armia, or Tudavaya Armia, if you don't want to contract it, in German, Arbeitsarmee. And then there is the mass expansion in 1942. GKO Order 1123 makes all men 17 to 50 who are ethnic Germans who were deported into Siberia and Kazakhstan eligible to be forcibly conscripted and sent to labor camps, mostly in the Urals, although there is one in Krasnoyarsk, Krasnodar, mostly for either industrial construction, such as the Bakalstroy, which is a construction of a ironworks, or Bogoslav log, which is a construction of aluminum works, or Solokamsk log, which is the construction of paper and cellulose factories. And so the camp log, but you also see Bakalstroy construction, Bogoslavstroy, Solokamstroy. So the construction site slash camp is interchangeable in the Soviet archives and other literature, or secondary literature about it as well. Most of the camps in the Urals that Germans are sent to deal with felling of trees, Usolog, Vietlog, are two big ones. And they set a initial goal of 120,000 to be conscripted, but they don't meet this number. It falls short. They only get about 67,000 for the camps, which are run by Gulag, main administration camp, and about 25,000 for railroad construction under the People's Commissariat of Transportation or Communication. It's the same. The NKPS under Kaganovich. And the conditions of the labor army become more and more like the Gulag, particularly for discipline, rations, and other material conditions. Although they are separated from convicted prisoners, they are not charged with any crimes, and they are not given any fixed sentences. They are to be mobilized for the duration of the war. They are to, when they get the draft notice, to show up to the NKO, People's Commissariat Defense, conscription points, and then they are turned over to the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, or in the case of about 25,000 initially to the People's Commissariat of Transportation. And then they are sent to the camp. Now, in one way, the labor army is worse than the convicts of the Gulag, which they are physically separated from in different camp points within the various labor camps they are sent. In that they have fixed rations that are the same as the Gulag, but they are not given automatically. Instead, they have to pay for them out of wages they receive for work, but the prices for the food and goods in the labor army work sites are extremely expensive, and so often they cannot afford the full Gulag ration, as small as it was, uh, given the wages that they were given. And of course, they never actually see any money. It's automatically just deducted for things like clothing and food provided to them. And I said often they can't even buy the complete Gulag ration with the amount they're given. So already they have a serious problem with food shortages in the labor army, and they will also have other health problems as a result of long hours of work, difficult physical work, particularly felling of trees and moving them, uh, but also disease, which is exacerbated by malnutrition. So you have a great deal of diseases related to vitamin deficiencies, protein deficiency, things like pellagra, things like scurvy, and very high death rates, as well as morbidity rates. So, some 315,000 Germans will ultimately be conscripted into the labor army. There'll be two more large conscriptions in 1942, and then some smaller ones in 1943. 182,000 of those are sent to Gulag camps, and about 30,000 are recorded dying in the camps, but the number that die shortly after being released is another 30,000, maybe 40,000. So we have 60 to 70,000 perishing as a result of their service in the labor army before 1955, mostly before 1948, which is when the labor army is formally dissolved. So they can't get enough people in the initial conscription, and part of this is local authorities wanting to keep them as a labor force, particularly those who are certain skills, such as combine and tractor drivers. On the kolkhozes, especially true in Kazakhstan. They then conscript about 40,000 ethnic German men that had already been in Siberia and Kazakhstan before the deportations in 1941. And so this greatly increases the number of labor army conscripts, again, mostly in the Urals, though there are some in Kazakhstan, Karaganda, coal mining, Krasnoyarsk, Kraslog is a logging camp. And you will then have massive mortality and morbidity again in the summer of 42. So we have a lull in spring between the sickness and death in the winter and then the sickness and death in the summer. So there's a third mass conscription in October of 1942, where the ages for men are extended to from 17 to 50 to 15 to 55. So now youth 15 to 16 and men 50 to 55 are now conscripted into the labor army, about 70,000 in this last large mobilization. But it also, they conscript women age 16 to 45 who are not pregnant and do not have children under the age of 3. About 50,000 of them are conscripted. And unlike the first two conscriptions in January and February, where all of the Labor Army inductees are sent to Gulag camps under control of the People's Commissary of Internal Affairs, with the exception of about 25,000 sent to work on rails construction on the NKPF. The October conscription sent most of the men to work in the coal industry under the People's Commissariat of Coal rather than the NKVD. They are supervised and watched over by the NKVD, but they are not working in labor camps or construction sites that are part of Gulag. They are the mines of the People's Commissariat of Coal, and most of the women are sent to work for the People's Commissariat of Oil to be extracting oil. And then a significant number, although less, are sent, again, mostly women, People's Commissariat of Munitions to work in armament factories. So that brings up that's the last large scale mobilization. There will be some smaller mobilizations, about 30,000 people total. Most of them women during 1943, and a significant number of those conscripts from 1943 will be sent to the coal mining camp of Vorkuta, a Gulag camp north of the Arctic Circle that is devoted to the mining of coal. So that is the final mobilizations in 1943. And then the system of the Labor Army will be dismantled piece by piece after the Second World War has already ended. But most Labor Army conscripts being finally released in 1948. So several years after the Soviet victory over Germany on 9th of May, 1945. And the conscription into the Labor Army solves the problem of social tension between a large number of very angry and very impoverished German deportees in Kazakhstan and Siberia. During the time of the Labor Army, most of the German deportees left in the special settlement areas are older than 55 for men and 45 for women, or children younger than 15 for men or 16 for women, or invalids, people who are not physically capable of doing any work for a variety of reasons. So it is difficult for them to work to earn labor days on the kolkhozes to exchange for bread and other food, because this is the weakest, sickest, and physically most incapable of hard physical labor section of the German population. The able-bodied adult population over 300,000 being employed in the labor army. Again, particularly in industrial construction and lumber camps being run by Gulag in the Urals. After the war, 8 January 1945, the restrictions on the special settlers are streamlined. There's 2 one-page decrees issued, but basically they are confined to the village which they were deported to, cannot leave it without special permission from special commandant of the NKVD, even to go short distance to the bazaar Rinok to shop or to visit relatives require the special permission. It's almost like getting a visa, and they're only good for 3 days. And if you do not abide by the restrictions, there are serious consequences. The special commanders can throw people in jail or fine them without any due process, but also there are special boards of the NKVD that can sentence people to the Gulag for disobeying the special settlement regime, attempting particularly to move without permission, to flee the confined, assigned village. In 6th of November 1948, the punishment for attempting to flee the assigned village by special settlers is increased to 20 years of hard labor. The exile itself is made permanent, not only for those who were themselves deported, but for their children and conceivably all other descendants going to eternity. In fact, the term forever is used in the document, na vechna. And there's a 5-year prison sentence for any free citizen caught helping special settlers escape from their assigned villages, attempt to return to the areas from which they were deported, or to search and find relatives that were separated during the initial forced relocation in 1941, or as a result of conscription into the labor army in 1942 and 1943. The Germans that were in Western and Central Ukraine, they are relocated to Poland, the Warthegau, by the German military, and then flee further west at the end of the war. But most of them, over 200,000 out of 300,000, are forcibly sent back to the Soviet Union by the U.S. and British militaries. There is no choice or option given to stay. The U.S. military issues orders that all Soviet citizens are returned to the Soviet Union regardless of their wishes. So these 200,000 Russian Germans that are forcibly repatriated are sent to Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Siberia, far north, where they also are placed under special settlement restrictions. Those in Tajikistan used on cotton colholtzes. Those in other areas used for various other forms of difficult labor. From 1945, 1946, after the war is over, of the 200,000 ethnic Germans that were in eastern parts of the Soviet Union before the 1941 deportation, about half, about 100,000, are placed under special settlement restrictions, particularly in Kazakhstan, about almost 50,000, but also other areas of Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. Most of the 100,000 not placed under special settlement restrictions are in Omsk Oblast, in Altai Krai, in Siberia, and Shakalov Oblast in the Urals. So the number of German special settlers increases with the forced repatriation and the placement of special settlement restrictions onto local Germans, particularly in Kazakhstan. So by 1st of January 1953, there are about 1.2 million German special settlers, and then another 100,000 ethnic Germans that are not special settlers in the Soviet Union. So 1.2 million out of a population of 1.3 million under special settlement restrictions, uh, including those former labor army conscripts that had not been deported, that had been forcibly conscripted under GKO Order 1281, 14th of February 1942. Those survivors are, upon their release, placed under special settlement restrictions, like the Germans that had been deported and then forcibly conscripted, or not conscripted because they were old or sick or children. So almost 90% or so of the German population of the Soviet Union live under these repressive restrictions and surveillance by the NKVD. They have to report every month, be interrogated by the NKVD and later the MVD. And these restrictions are only lifted on 13th of December 1955 for the population. Before that, there is in 1954 some easing of restrictions and release of minors under the age of 16. But even after the release in the end of 1955, they are not allowed to return from the areas from which they were deported, and they are not allowed to seek any compensation for property lost or confiscated during the deportations. So there is a movement after Stalin dies on 5th of March 1953. But the movement really doesn't start until the 29th of August 1964, where there's a partial rehabilitation decree. And then 29th August 1964, in large part as a result of pressure from West Germany, there is a decree by the Soviet government proclaiming that the Germans were not guilty of treason. They were not guilty of any crime whatsoever, but that they had become rooted in the areas of which they had been sent, and therefore they could not return to their old homeland in the Volga and Black Sea region and other western parts of the Soviet Union. This sparks from 1965 to 1967 a brief movement to try and convince the Soviet government to restore the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Social Republic. It fails. In the early 1970s, there is a movement for permission to emigrate out of the Soviet Union to Germany. It has a bit more success in the 70s. About 70,000 Germans in the Soviet Union are allowed to leave and settle as Aussiedler in the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. But for the most part, there is neither any restoration of any autonomy or permission for most of the population to leave the Soviet Union. So only 70,000 out of a population that by the end of the Soviet Union in 1989 was over 2 million people. It's only in 1987 that the Soviet government gives permission to the German population to emigrate if they have, if they want to. So we see a mass migration from 1987 on. It hits its peak in 1993 and 1994 with almost 200,000 Germans leaving the Soviet Union for West Germany, or unified Germany then, but still the Federal Republic of Germany during those 2 years. And the migration continues all the way up to about 2005, 2006, when it's greatly reduced, in part due to restrictions imposed by the German government. But by that time, the 2 million Germans in the former Soviet Union been reduced to about 600,000, about 400,000 in the Russian Federation, mostly in western Siberia, particularly Omsk, a German autonomous district again in Kosovo, and in Altai Krai, Halberstadt, which was one of the autonomous rayons in the early Soviet period, is restored. And then there's about 200,000 in Kazakhstan, mostly in the north, mostly around what is now Nur Sultan, but was at one time Akmola. And during the Khrushchev era, known as Leningrad. So most of the German population from the Soviet Union physically leaves Siberia and Kazakhstan and Central Asia to go to Germany. As I said, there's about 600,000 left. And this is pretty much the end of that particular chapter of history. So we've had a shift back after a quarter of a millennia, 250 years in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and the former colonists, the descendants of the former colonists, I guess, descendants of colonists, return to their ancestral homeland. Although, obviously, the BRD is very different from the various German states, Hesse, Baden, Württemberg, that the initial German colonists left in the late 18th and 19th centuries to settle in the Volga and Black Sea and other regions of European part of the Russian Empire. Well, one of the reasons why there is such a mass emigration, or the primary reason, is the repression and non-rehabilitation of the 1940s, in particular 1941 to 1948. And this is part of the years of great silence that's imposed by the Soviet government. And again, the rehabilitation attempt to restore Germans to full citizenship in the Soviet Union is only partial, and it's very slow. And so the arguments of the emigration movement in the 1970s pretty much become internalized by the whole population by the 1990s, and they leave. And historically, of course, this only starts to get dealt with uh, starting in the late 1980s. 1989 is the first publications really in Russian in the Soviet Union dealing with the subject. And we have quite a bit written in the 1990s. Now, increasingly large amounts being written in Germany. Most of the population has moved over there, including a number of their best historians, people like Eisfeld and Krieger. But very little still has been written about the subject in English. Uh, it is still not covered well by American or Canadian academia. It's not covered at all. I can see in Great Britain for some strange reason, but I'm not exactly sure why. Probably because there's no German from Russia population in the UK the way there is in Canada and the US. And so my book is an attempt to kind of provide this information. It's mostly based upon archival sources from Moscow, but some from Kyrgyzstan, some from Estonia, and it's some oral interviews again from Kyrgyzstan. Uh, so there's a lot more that can be said than what I wrote. The book is only about 300 pages, but I think it's a start here as to deal with it, because even though, as I note, the German in the Soviet Union kind of overwhelmed, overshadowed by both the Holocaust and the mass expulsion of Germans from Eastern Germany and Czechoslovakia into Germany at the end of the Second World War. It's a population of almost 1.5 million people, of which about 250,000 perished as a result of Soviet actions during the 1940s. Well, this is about, in both in terms of numbers and percentage, uh, similar to the losses suffered by the Roma and Sinti people during the Second World War. It's quite significantly high. 245,000 deaths is my estimate. And it really hasn't been dealt with, as I said, at all prior to 1989. But even then, most of what has been written, most of what has been compiled, has been either in Russian in the former Soviet Union or in German in Germany. But as far as international uh, access, means being written in English, very, very little has been produced. And so hopefully, Years of Great Silence will end the silence and maybe create a greater dialogue and discourse on the subject.